Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar featuring foreign policy expert Ilan Berman discussing Russia's strategies and motivations in Ukraine, the Middle East, and beyond. I'm guessing you all know me by now, but for those who do not, I'm Emmet's New York chapter president, and I'm a member of its board and its advisory board. A couple of weeks ago, I hosted Morgan Ortegas on a webinar discussing foreign policy and why voters should care about these issues in the midterm elections. So I'm very happy to be following that discussion with Ilan Berman to hear his insights on Russia and why it poses a threat to American security and world peace, and why strong American leadership is required in the face of current world affairs. Once again, these should be issues upon which voters focus when electing their representatives in a few weeks. As an Emmet board member, advisory board member, and its New York chapter president, I feel passionately about the immense importance of Emmet's work in helping to formulate a strong U.S. foreign policy, leading to greater national security for all of us. So I thank you all for joining today and supporting our work. As always, I'll ask you to please follow us at www.emmetonline.org, and please consider making a financial donation. It is your support that enables us to continue our important work, including holding our weekly webinars with such esteemed panelists as Ilan. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be available for viewing and sharing. If you have any questions for Ilan, you can write them in at the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please be sure to use the Q&A button rather than the chat feature, and I'll get to as many later in the program as possible. Ilan Berman is Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. An expert on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation, he has consulted with the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, as well as the U.S. Department of State and Defense, and has also provided assistance on foreign policy and national security issues to a range of governmental agencies and congressional offices. He has been called one of America's leading experts on the Middle East and Iran by CNN. Ilan is a member of the Associated Faculty at Missouri State University's Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. A frequent writer and commentator, he has written for the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, the Washington Post, and USA Today, among many other publications. He is the editor of 6 books, has authored 5 books, and often testifies before Congress on various foreign policy matters. Welcome, Ilan.
Great to be here.
Let's begin by having you share your insights on Russia's strategic motivations in going to war in Ukraine. Was it to impinge on the US-led world order? Was it nationalistic in the hopes of rebuilding a greater Soviet empire? Did Putin really feel threatened by NATO, or is it something else? The last time Putin invaded Ukraine was in 2014 when he illegally annexed Crimea. The Obama-Biden administration seemed as flat-footed back then as the Biden-Harris administration does today. In fact, Walter Russell Mead wrote a recent piece in the Wall Street Journal in which he stated, quote, "Not deterring Russian aggression was one of the costliest failures in recent American foreign policy." And former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stated this past weekend that Biden's failure to deter Vladimir Putin was, quote, "maybe one of the greatest foreign policy failures of the last decades." Can you share with our audience what exactly is motivating Putin and what the U.S. should be doing differently to deter him and future aggression?
Sure. Well, so I think there's a lot here to unpack. So let me just sort of walk through a couple of things that I think are important. And in order to understand our problem, our lack of understanding of Russia, you almost have to cycle back to the late 1940s, right? So in the late 1940s, George Kennan, who became the US ambassador to Moscow during sort of at the height of the Cold War, was at that time a sort of a mid-level to senior diplomat in Moscow, and he wrote a cable which came to be known as the Long Telegraph, right? And so from his perch in Moscow, he was laying out what he saw as the Soviet Union's worldview, the strategic culture, what they were trying to achieve globally. And this was an enormously influential document, right? It was published the following year in Foreign Affairs, pseudonymously, and it became the sort of the skeleton upon which successive administrations built the containment strategy that ultimately ended the Cold War, right? But all of that started from an accurate understanding of the sources of Soviet conduct, right? The sort of what made the Soviet Union tick. And the reason that's important is because we have gone along for a good quarter century without any sort of an analog about what makes Russia tick. We don't have a good understanding of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin's been in office since the last days of 1999. Until very, very recently, there were only a handful of people that could really authoritatively talk about his worldview, what he wants, what he's trying to accomplish. That's a huge strategic failure because it sets us up to be surprised like we were in the late 2000s in Georgia when Russia moved to annex and to create to sort of establish the independence of cantons like Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It sort of caught us flat-footed in Crimea in 2014 when Russia invaded, sort of using asymmetric force, and then had a stage-managed referendum. And then sort of retroactively use that referendum to bless its control over parts of Ukraine, like the Crimean Peninsula. And it caught us flat-footed now, right? And in the run-up to the late February decision by the Kremlin to invade, you saw official after official, intelligence agency after intelligence agency say, well, he's not serious, right? These are just military maneuvers. We don't really understand. My argument is this, right? In order to understand what Putin wants and where he's going, you sort of really have to understand the animating drivers, right? Like what's he trying to get out of it? And this is why I tend to cringe a little bit anytime you have a government official or a former government official talk about how Vladimir Putin is trying to recreate the Soviet Union, because that's actually not what he's trying to do. If you look at his speech, so he gave two real formative speeches. In one ahead, right, February 21st, before the invasion, ahead of the invasion, essentially laying out his case, right? This is why this is necessary. And one on February 24th, which was the sort of, look what I just did. Here's why I just did it, right? And in both of those presentations, he actually spends a lot of time lambasting, very obliquely, very respectfully, but lambasting the Soviet Union, right? He spends a lot of time talking about how our current contemporary Ukrainian problem was actually created by the Soviet Union. Why? Because the Soviet Union had a very delicate balance of all these ethnicities that existed within the USSR. And by the way, the guy that was the Soviet Commissar of Nationalities, because that was an actual job in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was Joseph Stalin. So before he ascended to be General Secretary, he was the Commissar of Nationalities. So it was, in Putin's conception, it was Stalin's fault that all these provinces, including Ukraine, had too much autonomy, sort of began to think of themselves as independent nationalities, independent identities. The frame that Putin wants is not that. He doesn't want to recreate the Soviet Union. He wants to recreate the Russian Empire. And that's why he talks a lot about territorial acquisition. That's why he talks a lot about how Ukrainians and Russians are one people, right? Because the sort of his idea of a greater Russia thrives sort of on this homogeneity, right? Even if it needs to be imposed by force, right? There's another driver, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, which is demographics, right? Russia as a country is declining in terms of its population, declining pretty significantly. And so I think it's not useful to think about the fact that Russia simply wants to reclaim the USSR, sort of the parts of the USSR that broke away, because that's frankly not true. They don't want to reclaim all of these parts equally. Even though the countries of Central Asia are a bit concerned about Russian imperialism, right? I have news for them. They're not first on the hit parade, right? Russia wants the place where the Slavs are, the ethnic Slavic peoples that can reconstitute the Russian Federation, reconstitute the population greatness of the country. That's places like Ukraine. That's places like Belarus. That's parts of Kazakhstan, other parts, right? But those are the places that are the first and most immediate targets of this sort of new neo-imperial aspiration that Putin has.
Is it a coincidence, though, that Ukraine, sits, right on the edge of NATO?
Well, so the NATO conversation is sort of interesting, because I always found it very strange that, Putin, at least in the beginning, was using this sort of, the fig leaf of, I'm invading Ukraine to ward off NATO expansionism because NATO's coming. Because, right, the practical effect is that he's so worried about NATO that he actually inserted military troops closer to NATO troops, right? Which is kind of not what you do if you're really worried about NATO. But I think the NATO question looms really large, not because Ukraine is going to get NATO membership imminently, right? That obviously Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky really wants to be fast-tracked for NATO membership. He understands their strength in numbers. He understands the deterrence potential of the Atlantic Alliance. I'm not sure that's in the cards. And I think President Biden and European officials have been very clear that that's not in the cards. But I think it's necessary to frame the Ukraine war not as a one-off event, but as the way I like to think about it is that Russia is trapped in a box. In many ways, a geopolitical box of its own making, right? Because of its bad relations with Europe, because it sees itself as a distinct non-European, non-Asian identity, right? It's standing sort of by itself. But over the years, the expansion of the European zone of freedom, right? European democracy, European prosperity, NATO, right? All of these things have made the box smaller. So Putin is trying in all these different ways to push against the sides of the box, to try to open up the box. And what he's doing in Ukraine is an attempt to get the West to roll back its influence, right? He's seen for years this creeping Western influence in what we would think is a very positive sense in terms of values, in terms of economic prosperity and development. He sees that as an existential threat because it threatens the way that he's organized his own government. So he sees Ukraine as a sort of test case. But Ukraine is not the end of the story, right? So we see, right, we're in the political silly season here in the United States, right? We're thoroughly in the thick of it. And so we see a lot of people saying, well, maybe we should just let them have Ukraine because it'll sort of stop there. The problem is that the Ukrainians understand, but everybody in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, understands very well that a conversation that starts with Ukraine doesn't end with Ukraine, because Putin's real problem is not Ukraine. I mean, he has issues with Ukraine, but Putin's real problem is with the Western-led liberal order, right? And like it or not, we're a part of that. So we're a part of that fight.
Very interesting. Thanks for that insight. So back in August, you wrote a column in which you stated, quote, "It is already clear that across metrics that matter, political standing, economic prosperity, and military prowess, the costs of the present conflict have already become exorbitantly high, both for Russia and for ordinary Russians," end quote. As we read that Russia is now forcing its citizens to enlist in a depleted and in some ways defeated army, and of battlefield losses, including the destruction of Putin's prize bridge leading from Russia to Crimea, can you share with us how the war is actually going and how you see this impacting Putin's standing in Russia, as well as perhaps touching on Russia's standing on the world stage? Is there infighting within the Putin camp and among the Russian ruling elite and military leadership? And do you think that Putin can survive?
Right. Well, so there's a lot to unpack here, but I think I think that article and that assessment is sort of held up really well over time, because you can sort of see on an almost rolling basis that the Russian military offensive is losing steam. The Russians are on the back foot. The Ukrainians, to their own surprise, are doing remarkably well on the battlefield, right? Obviously reinforced by Western arms. We've had a very big role to play in that. But you're increasingly seeing a situation where it is conceivable that the end state of this conflict is a victorious Ukraine, right? That not only is victorious and stands its ground, but actually pushes Russia out of the Donbass, pushes Russia out of the Crimean Peninsula, right? That was inconceivable half a year ago, right? Half a year ago, a little bit more, excuse me, we were talking about how we think Kiev is going to collapse in 3 days and there's going to be regime change. And if that had actually happened, I think there'd be no question that the support for Ukraine would not have been forthcoming. But success breeds success, and so the Ukrainians mustered a stronger than expected resistance. The Russians mustered a weaker than expected military offensive, right? And in the process, dispelled all this self-deterrence that we had done over the last 2 decades, right? The most remarkable thing to me about all this is that we, in our heads, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, had built up the idea that the Russian military is 10 feet tall and we can't countenance any sort of conflict because they will eat our lunch. And so a friend of mine recently said to me something which I think is exactly right, that Russia began the current conflict in Ukraine as the second strongest military in Europe. It is currently the second strongest military in Ukraine, right? Which is a really remarkable sort of shrinking of Russian prestige, shrinking of sort of, the mystique of Russia. And so you're seeing that in spades. You're seeing a constriction of the Russian economy, even though Russian officials are dramatically sort of overplaying their hand, right? They're talking a lot about, long-term economic stability. The ruble has stabilized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What they're not talking about is the fact that the Russian national airline, Aeroflot, has been forced to start, like the Iranians, by the way, start stripping airliners that they have currently in service for spare parts, because they can't get spare parts from the West. They can no longer, there will come a point, we're not quite there, but there will come a point where Russia no longer has any more really sophisticated high-tech munitions, because the microchips that they need in order to build them come from the West. And now there's sanctions imposed, right? So again, this is not a sort of an impermeable barrier. There's stuff getting through. The Russians are muddling along for now. But the economic picture is, if you look into the future, right, we've already seen effectively the erasure of 3 decades of post-Cold War economic development, right? And this gets worse for the Russians as we go on. And then there's the people, right? And I'll stop there. But the people, to me, is the most remarkable thing. So as I mentioned, right, Russia's in demographic decline. Right, the Russian population for decades has been below what's called replenishment, right? Replenishment is that magic 2.1 number, right? A child to replace the woman, a child to replace the man, and 0.1 for accidents and earthquakes and whatever, acts of God. The Russians have been well below that. They've been sort of hovering at around European levels, which are frankly not great. But this has been dramatically exacerbated by the war. So you saw the sort of this massive exodus of Russians on top of the people who were generally leaving every year when the war started. And since the end of September, when Putin announced his partial mobilization, you've seen almost 1 million people, additional people, leave Russia, right? Because all of a sudden the war's come home. Before, the war was sort of distant, it was over there. Now it's affecting Russians, right? Because on paper, the partial mobilization is supposed to be something like 300,000 people and only reservists. In practice, it's closer to 1 million people, and it's mostly drawing from ethnic minorities, right? The Russian Muslim minority, the Mongolian minority, right? Others. So it's actually, Putin's creating another problem for himself down the road, because he's exacerbating all sorts of these internal latent tensions, right? Because he's sort of, it's the burden is not shared equally. But the Russians are increasingly voting with their feet, right? They see this not just as a failed national project, which you can make a pretty good case that it was before. They see this as deeply hazardous to their own health and their well-being and the well-being of their family. So they're leaving. They're going to Finland and Kazakhstan and Europe, but in a way that, quite frankly, is creating a situation that is putting enormous pressure on Putin at home, right? Both from the grassroots, but I don't think anybody thinks there's going to be a revolution tomorrow in Russia that unseats Putin. What's much more important is the circle of advisors, circles of influential people who surround him, who may have some of the same goals or may have similar goals, but the endpoint of their career evolution may not be his, right? And those are the people that increasingly you see European officials and Western officials messaging to, right? Saying, listen, if you guys continue down this path, there's going to be catastrophic consequences. Because the idea here is to cause cracks in the Kremlin, right? To cause fissures in that decision-making circle. And I think we're beginning to see that happen. Now, it's not transparent. It's very opaque. It's hard to tell from the outside. But I think that's very much the game plan on the part of the United States and its allies in Europe.
So that's a good segue into my next question, because I'm sure everybody is waiting for me to ask about nukes. As Putin becomes more and more desperate, there are fears that he's also becoming more irrational. Putting aside his desperation in annexing the 4 Ukrainian territories, he's also threatening this tactical nuclear strike or strikes. So again, going back to the Walter Russell Mead column, Mead also stated, quote, "The only way to deter any possible use of nuclear weapons is to make Mr. Putin believe that the consequences of such use will be ruinous for Russia as a state and for him as its ruler, and that the West won't flinch when the time for action comes." Putting aside also this, Armageddon statement that Biden made in his fundraiser. I mean, do you think that Putin will in fact use tactical nukes? And if he does, what do you think the West's reaction will be? And what the US and NATO, and what do you think the US and NATO should do, which could be very much different from what they actually do?
Actually, right. Well, so I agree with Walter, like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way, right? Because I think the formula is exactly right. But the people that we need to pressure is not Putin, right? Or the person or persons we need to pressure is not Putin. My sense is, right, from everything that I'm seeing, right, Putin is sort of locked on this path of escalation. He is losing so dramatically that the only way he can sort of pull the iron out of the fire is to actually go further, right? To gamble big. What I'm much more concerned about is the fact that, we are sending the right signals to the people around Putin, who may not be willing to gamble as much as he's gambling. He does not see an exit. He does not see a golden parachute and, maybe retirement in Kazakhstan or, whatever it is, right? I don't think he envisions that that's in the cards for him. But there are other stakeholders who have political aspirations beyond Putin, who want to remain in Russia, stakeholders who have fortunes that are adversely affected by what Putin is doing, right? These are the people that we can exert pressure on, that can then sort of turn around and exert pressure on Putin. And that's why I was actually sort of really taken by what you heard, right? So the Biden administration made a point of going around on the Sunday talk shows a couple of weeks ago, folks like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, and talking about how they were messaging to the Kremlin about the catastrophic consequences that can ensue if the Russians even contemplate deployment and, let alone usage of nuclear weapons. I think that's exactly the right message, but it's not necessarily a message that should be directed at Putin. It's a message that should be directed at the Russian elites, right? You want to make them stakeholders. You want to lock them in the country. You want to make them have their government act more responsibly. Because my sense is Putin is Putin has made his decision already. Whether we do that, whether we continue to message that way, it remains to be seen. What I'm concerned about is a couple things. First of all, there is a very strong for now, minority opinion that's sort of shying away from maintaining our steadfast support against the specter of Russian tactical nuclear weapons, right? So you hear a lot of people saying, oh my God, this is escalation. We don't want this. We don't want a third nuclear war. For a whole host of reasons, I think it's not out of the realm of possibility, but I don't think that's a likelihood. Because there's lots of checks and balances to the Russian nuclear arsenal and all that stuff. But that sort of messaging, that self-deterrence, is precisely what Putin is looking for. Look, in September, at the end of September, when he announced his partial mobilization, that speech actually had three parts. One was the mobilization. We're going to add more troops to the military. The second was the announcement of the stage-mannered referenda for four Ukrainian provinces. And the third was the threat of nuclear force. And they all work in tandem. We need more troops to take those territories and hold those territories. We're going to massage the politics so those territories become Russia, and then we're going to extend our nuclear umbrella over them. That's what he's trying to do, because he sees that as sort of a last stand, right? Maybe he can't take all of Ukraine, but by engaging in this sort of brinksmanship, he can lop off, salami slice parts of Ukraine in a way, the West will be deterred. The West won't want to escalate. For a whole host of reasons, I think that it's not likely, but the Western messaging is really important here, because if we show weakness in the face of Russian nuclear threats, he's just going to make those nuclear threats again down the line, right? And by the way, all of this is happening not just in in Russia and Ukraine, right? Everybody's watching. The Iranians are watching. The Chinese are watching. That sort of nuclear brinksmanship, if we capitulate to it, is going to have all sorts of consequences for other rogue nations. For example, in a Taiwan scenario, with regard to China down the line, right? Things like that. So I think it's enormously consequential. And my fervent hope is that we we see it for what it is, which is this really dangerous bluff.
I mean, do you think that there's a chance that Biden will pressure Zelensky into accepting a ceasefire in order to let Putin walk away with his couple of annexed, pieces of, treasure for him, and the ability to claim victory, providing some sort of off-ramp, as they're calling it, for Putin to save face?
So I think there are certainly folks around the president that are sort of, of the mind that, every war must end. We should we should be driving to this sort of conclusion. The problem is the Russians are collapsing so dramatically and the Ukrainians are winning so dramatically that Zelensky is not. Listen, if the situation was more mixed, you could sort of see this as a viable option. But if you're Zelensky and you actually believe that you're winning, your desire for half measures or your appetite for half measures is pretty small, right? Why would you accept Russian sovereignty over Crimea, which the Ukrainians believe, I think correctly, was unjustly taken from them, when you're within, a fighting shot of actually being able to take it back? Why would you do that? Why would you settle for that? So the problem that we have is that the Russian collapse has been so dramatic and so absolute that it actually mitigates against some sort of compromise, right? And that's why the nuclear question becomes so important.
I guess the only way to do that, is from Biden's and the West standpoint, is to start withholding, instead of providing these aerial defenses, right, and other military equipment, to withhold it to force a ceasefire.
Right. Well, and that's the sort of the needle that the administration is trying to thread, because the Ukrainians, From the Ukrainian perspective, they want all the weapons they can get their hands on, including long-range munitions that can strike into Russian territory. And the way the Biden administration and its European partners have been allocating these resources, they've been very sort of circumspect about giving them long-range weaponry that would allow the Ukrainians to take the fight to the Russians, right? Because they sort of understand that that's a level of escalation that's not necessary. But the problem is that we're in this, right? We're in now. And I think correctly, very committed to sort of, Ukraine maintaining its independence. If we start rolling back our aid now, it also sends a very dangerous signal to the Russians, right? Because it doesn't cause the Russians to back down. It could very easily cause the Russians to double down on their military campaign because they're like, oh, the West is sort of pulling back. So I think this is a very vexing challenge. I'm not sure there's very many very good answers right now.
Okay, so I'm going to move beyond Ukraine, because you work in a number of different areas, but in the context of discussing the Middle East, your expertise on Russia, Iran, and radical Islamism comes together. So I want you to talk about Russia in the context of current events in the Middle East and its relationship in particular with Iran. Prior to Obama's 8 years in office, we wouldn't have been talking about Russia in the context of the Middle East. Russia hadn't been a player in the region for decades until Obama invited him in to deal with the mess in Syria. Can you discuss what motivated Russia to actually move back into the region, what it gained from doing that, and what you believe Russia's current role is in the Middle East? Besides brokering a horrific nuclear deal between the US and Iran, that is, because we know that they're doing that,
right.
But especially also given the lack of stability that we're seeing since Obama ended the Pax Americana that had kept relative stability there for decades. And of course, if you could please share how its war in Ukraine has impacted its strategic partnership with Iran and its role in the Middle East more broadly.
Sure. Well, and so I think that the sort of, it's always nice when you work on, three separate things, right? Islamic extremism in Iran and Russia, and then they all sort of, start coming together. It just makes my life easier. But what I think has been really remarkable that a lot of people sort of haven't been tracking has been the degree to which over the last 7 years, the Russians have really made a return to the Middle East. So the Russians, historically, they've always had Middle Eastern ambitions, and they always have seen the Middle East as this sort of zone of competition where they can compete, they can prop up unsavory regimes, and in that way, check the influence of the United States, check the influence of American allies, including Israel, right? But ever since the Soviet collapse, there's been this retraction of Russian foreign policy. Doesn't mean that the Russians weren't interested, but it just means that they didn't have a lot of throw weight in the Middle East. And all of that began to change, as you pointed out, right, in the context of Syria. I'm not sure, by the way, I'm not sure that Obama invited him in the context of, this was a Russian decision driven by a whole host of internal factors. I'm not sure Obama was prepared to keep him out, right? I think that's the formulation, right? But Syria, very clearly, the Russians used this as a springboard. Right before Russia's decision in September of 2015 to engage in a military campaign in support of Bashar al-Assad, the Russians had one military base, one naval base, right, very piddly naval base in the port city of Tartus in Syria, on the western seaboard of Syria, that they had since the 1970s. They had no sustained military, sort of large-scale military presence in the Middle East or in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? This was aspirational. This wasn't actual. And then you cycle forward and you look at what the presence looks like today, right? Russia has used, over the last 7 years, has used Syria as a springboard to strengthen its ties to the Persian Gulf, to expand its influence in Syria, to start all sorts of military relationships with countries in North Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So, and they've been able to do this, frankly, because we've seen this general sort of, across administrations, this retraction from the region, right? The problem is, I know you would like very much for us to have a full-throated Middle East policy, but that these days tends to be the exception rather than the norm, right? We're not that involved in the region. And because we're not, other countries like Russia are. And so what I find remarkable about this conflict, because the conflict's actually really new, right? Over the scale of conflicts, right? We're talking about 7 months. We're not even at the 8-month mark of the Ukraine war yet, even though we all feel like we've been dealing with it for an eternity. In those 7.5 months, the Russian international position in places like Africa, in places like the Middle East, has collapsed almost totally, right? You see Russia being forced to pull troops out of those regions, bring them back home to deal with the Ukraine mess. You see, right, Russia tends to employ paramilitary groups, including the notorious Wagner group of mercenaries that it's seeded all over Africa. Those guys are now leaving, they're going back. to Russia because they need to be deployed as frontline troops for the Ukraine war. So you're seeing this very dramatic constriction of Russia's global ambitions because the Ukraine war is going so badly. And you see this in the context of Iran as well, right? Because historically, the Russian-Iranian relationship has been the most vexing part of their Middle East engagement, right? Russia has carried the water for Iran at the UN Security Council, has diluted sanctions, has done all sorts of things, unhelpful things. And for a long time, we sort of understood that the Russians were the senior partner. And so every administration had this idea, ultimately fruitless idea, that, oh, somehow we could flip Russia, right? If we just offer them enough inducements, they'll flip on the Iranians, they'll flip on the Ayatollahs, and maybe they'll get the Iranian regime to sort of behave better. None of that happened. It didn't happen under Bush. It didn't happen under Obama. It didn't happen under Trump. It's not happening under Biden. But something else is happening, right? Historically, the Russians have been the senior partner, right? And the Iranians have had to go to Moscow and bend the knee and sort of ask for Russian assistance. But now the opposite is happening. Now, Russian officials, including Vladimir Putin himself over the summer, went to Tehran to ask the Iranians for assistance. Why? Because the Iranians are now more integrated into the global system, thanks largely to the Biden administration and sort of the attempt to revive the nuclear deal. The Iranians at that time were on the cusp of what looked like a pretty dramatic economic windfall as a result of that deal. The Iranians were getting reintegrated into global diplomacy, and the Russians were the ones that were the increasingly the international pariah. There were Western sanctions. There was limitations on technology that could be sold. They were running out of military equipment, and so all of a sudden the shoe's on the other foot. And the Russians are the ones that are asking the Iranians for assistance. Right? That's what the Iranian drone situation in Ukraine is all about. It's the fact that the Russians were so desperate for arms that they had to ask the Iranians for military material that they can throw into the Ukraine fight. Paradoxically, I think we're also discovering that the Ukrainians don't make very good drones, right? Because they're not faring very well, which is, I think, very useful for our military to know as well. But the reality, the geopolitical reality, is that all of a sudden, Russia is the supplicant, right? That relationship has been turned on its head. Russia is the supplicant. So there's pretty dramatic things that are afoot here. And my sense is that as the conflict goes on, Russia's global position erodes even further, right? Because you can sort of see it in the way everybody, including Russian allies like China, are being very circumspect about the Ukraine war, right? They tend to like Russia more than they like us still, for all sorts of reasons that make a lot of sense. But they also understand that what Russia is doing is failing, and it's failing catastrophically, and it may end up being a liability for them.
So I want to bring the Saudis into this now. I think one thing that the Biden administration can take credit for is pushing the Saudis into the arms of the Russians. Right. As Biden goes hat in hand to the Saudi crown prince, begging him to increase oil production since he's insanely decided to end our energy independence established under Trump policies and reestablish our dependence on foreign oil. OPEC Plus, which includes Russia, decided to do the opposite and actually cut oil production. As a result, several Democrat lawmakers are calling on the Biden administration to now withhold American military assistance to the Saudis. And Senator Robert Menendez, much to my chagrin, who chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is calling to freeze all aspects of our cooperation with Saudi Arabia, which I believe is an uninformed and dangerous policy position, given that the U.S. defense systems provided to the Saudis are essential in preventing Iranian attacks on the Gulf nations. Can you discuss Russia's relationship with the Saudis and why furthering that relationship while at the same time impairing the relationship between the Saudis and the U.S. could be harmful to U.S. interests?
Right. So, okay. So I think this an anecdote really sort of illustrates this very well. So in the spring of last year, so long before spring of 2021, long before the Ukraine war was sort of a glimmer in the eye of Vladimir Putin, the Russian deputy defense minister hosted his Saudi counterpart, right? The Saudi deputy defense minister came to a international trade show, military trade show in Moscow. And so that in itself was not significant. What was significant was that he signed a whole raft of military cooperation agreements between Riyadh and Moscow during that visit, right? And it was reported on in all the defense press. And the reason that's significant is because that's a pretty fundamental turnaround, because for decades, the Saudis have looked to us as their dominant military supplier, as their sort of their arms sales partner of choice. But increasingly, because the Biden administration, since coming in, has decided that they've really taken the Saudis to the woodshed, right? Hammer and tongs. They're really sort of, pressuring them in all sorts of different ways. The Saudis are making other plans, right? And so for a long time, the Russians have been sort of the Saudi fallback option, right? The Chinese economically, the Russians militarily. As there's growing distance between Riyadh and Washington, you're seeing the House of Saud pivot towards this more sort of, balancing role, right? There was a time where the Saudis were unequivocally sort of in our camp. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think there's lots of reasons, right? Very justifiable reasons why they're not, because they haven't gotten a very good reception from the United States under the current administration, but it has consequences. So the idea that the Biden administration could hammer them about the ears on human rights for a year, then come to them hat in hand when gas prices are high in the United States and expect them to just roll over, I think was frankly unrealistic. And the OPEC Plus decision was built around market calculations in Riyadh and market calculations in other places. It wasn't built around calculations about the strength of the US-Saudi relationship, because the US-Saudi relationship is not that strong. And so, this has all sorts of consequences. My sense is that, militarily, the Saudis are having second thoughts about the Russians because they're seeing what I'm seeing, which is that the Russian military is in full-throated collapse, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be propelled back into our arms, right? What we do with regard to Saudi Arabia matters a great deal. And I'd only point out, yesterday, the Biden administration released this national security strategy, and it talks about a whole lot of things, right? And for those viewers who are sort of interested in how they cast issues like China and great power competition, and even the Abraham Accords, which they mentioned, right, belatedly, but they mentioned, which is like all very important. You know what they don't mention, even once in the entire document? Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia is not present in the discussion of allies, which tells you everything you need to know about the way the Biden administration is thinking about the kingdom, is thinking about the House of Saud and its future relationship. And, those decisions tend to have consequences. And so my sense is that, in this equation, as we're looking at the Middle East, the sort of our big hope is that the positive dynamics of the Abraham Accords expand to involve Saudi Arabia more, because they're not going to get involved more based on the strength of their relationship with the United States, because that relationship isn't that strong.
Right. Well, what was my fear that these moves by the Biden administration and Democrats would actually delay or prevent the Abraham Accords from being expanded to include the Saudis. I mean, if the U.S. was doing any kind of job of trying to broker that, that's done. The U.S. isn't. But at the same time, I guess you made a good point, that which is maybe perhaps the Saudis will turn to the Israelis because they are the strong horse.
Right. Well, and maybe, and the problem that I've sort of always seen with in the context of the Abraham Accords is that I'm not sure the last administration framed it quite correctly in its sort of desire to take credit for it, right? The Trump administration deserves enormous credit for midwifing the Abraham Accords, not for creating them, because a lot of those dynamics, most of those dynamics existed before. They were built around a shared concern about Iran. They were built around quiet economic ties that the Trump administration brought out into the open, but it didn't create them. But the problem is that in many ways, the Moroccans, the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, they are the low-hanging fruit because they have the most strategic logic to partner with Israel, right? They were the ones that needed the least amount of coaxing to bring out into the open. There are other countries, Saudi Arabia, right? Beyond that, Indonesia, other countries, right? That need a little bit more cajoling, a little bit more coaxing. And that's the role, that's the proper role of the United States. And you simply can't do that. You can't bring them on board if you don't talk about the Abraham Accords for a full year, if you fail to recognize that they exist because the last guy did it for a whole year, right? It's bad policy, but it's also counterproductive to your own goals. Because now, belatedly, the Biden administration is leaning into all this dynamism that we're seeing in the region, but nobody in the region is buying what they're putting down.
So before I get into the audience questions, and there are quite a lot of them, I just wanted to bring China and perhaps India into the discussions.
Sure.
Putin recently met with President Xi, and while it does not appear that China is giving any kind of military aid to Russia in support of its war in Ukraine, neither Modi nor Xi agreed to impose sanctions on Russia, and it seems that neither will support a request for an oil price cap that could be used to pressure Russia in the future. Craig Singleton from FDD argued that Xi is wedded to Putin's war because China has much to gain geopolitically from a Russia victory and potentially even more to lose from a Russian defeat. At the same time, however, after Monday's escalations with Russia sending missiles into Kiev, both China and India called for de-escalation, seemingly distancing themselves from Russia's latest measures. Can you explain this complicated relationship and whether you think China will be forced at some point to help out Russia through military assistance and its impact, again, on U.S. national security and international relations?
Sure. So I can try. I think Craig gets it partly right. And here's what I mean. I think China has a lot to gain if Russia wins, right? Or if Russia successfully deters the West, because, right, for China, priority number one is Taiwan. And if the nuclear bluster that you're seeing now causes a qualitative change in the way the West approaches Ukraine, as sort of a diminution in support for Ukraine, that's very instructive for the Chinese, right? They can attack Taiwan. They can, sort of come to the conclusion they can attack Taiwan, they can hold Taiwan, they can threaten the West with nukes, and Taiwan will be theirs, right? There'll be nothing to worry about. But I actually sort of would argue that China has a lot to win, sort of will win significantly if Russia loses as well, right? So here's, I like anecdotes. So here's another anecdote. So the Russian-Chinese border, right? So Russia is a country that spans 9 separate time zones. A very large percentage of its border abuts first Mongolia. And so if you look at a map, first Mongolia and then China in the east, right? The Russian Far East sits squarely atop of territorial China. That border was only demarcated like a second ago in historical terms. That border was demarcated in 2001, and it was only demarcated for a period of 20 years, right? Actually, they just did the sort of the re-signing ceremony, of the treaty last year. The reason that's the case is because that territory was Chinese. That was Chinese territory that was taken, rapaciously, advantageously taken from China in the aftermath of the Second Opium War in the 1860s. The Chinese remember this. The Chinese have a long history, and they also understand what's happening in Russia. In the Russian Far East, in Western Siberia, in the Russian Far East, the population of those territories has declined by a quarter since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because all of a sudden people were allowed to leave. They out-migrated, they migrated to Asia, they migrated to what's called European Russia. And so there are now, in the Russian Far East, there are now on average less than 6 Russians per square kilometer. So it's a sort of smaller population density than Wyoming, right? So if you're a Chinese official and you have constraints on resources, you're looking for new sources of oil, of softwood lumber, of minerals, and you look north and you see this territory that is basically unpopulated, right? You might start getting some less than friendly ideas, right? And so my sense is that the Chinese are being circumspect about this because they understand that right now their partnership with Russia in ideological terms is stronger than any sort of cooperation they have with the West. I don't know how long that holds up over time, because historically it hasn't been cooperation that's driven the Russian-Chinese relationship. It's been competition. And you see this all over Central Asia and the Caucasus. And my sense is if Russia declines, and if Russia declines precipitously and it can't hold territory in the Far East, right, that's no longer a conversation about a Russian-Chinese alliance. That's a conversation about how well China can live by picking off the carcass of a decaying Russian Federation.
Okay, great. So I do have one other quick question before we go to the audience's questions, and it goes to Russia's disinformation campaign that's been going on for years. You wrote a column last year recognizing that Russia's disinformation offensive hasn't garnered nearly enough critical attention in the US. So can you discuss that and what the administration should and could be doing to counter this offensive? Sure.
So disinformation, again, right? We have this sort of in America, I'm sure in every country, but I can only speak to sort of what's happening here. But we have this tendency that when we become aware of a political problem, right, like disinformation, we assume A, that it's new, and B, that it's our problem to fix, right? There's always there's this rush for solutions. The reality is that Russian disinformation in its various forms is a very sort of long-standing phenomenon. It goes back to sort of the what's known as active measures that were used by the Soviet Union during the decades of the Cold War to shape global opinion, to sort of to seed fake stories about the West in a way that sort of diminishes the appeal of the West, increases Soviet appeal. Right? The Russians have sort of turbocharged this idea, but they also have a different goal. Right. And so we obviously, all of us have heard a lot about Russian disinformation and election meddling. And there tends to be this very knee-jerk reaction. Oh, well, the Russians like this candidate and they dislike this candidate. Or, they weighed in to advantage one, but to disadvantage another, or they're trying to do, whatever. But the reality is the Russians don't really care so much about one candidate over another. They may have preferences, but what they're really after is a diminution in trust in democracy. Because ultimately, all politics is local. Vladimir Putin has a vertically integrated authoritarian state. He has people in his country that are rallying all the time against this. If he is able to put some dings into the armor of the West, into the armor of Western democracy, he can use that as an example and say, hey, I know you guys think you have it bad, but look how crazy it is over there. Look how crazy it is in Washington, right? So yeah, just sit tight, right? The goal of Russian disinformation is to confuse the truth. Right, it is to start to create this wall of sound that really disincentivizes people from mobilizing. Right, that's something that he's been doing to great effect in terms of his own domestic constituency and his near abroad. Right, the countries of Central Asia and the Caucasus, and increasingly you saw that begin to bleed into the West, including in the United States. Now, as a result of the Ukraine war, we have belatedly started to get serious about Russian disinformation. We talked about it in the context of our elections in 2016 and then again in 2020. But in Europe, you're seeing some pretty significant moves to, for example, to force satellite providers to no longer carry Russian state-owned media, right? No longer carry Russia Today, no longer carry Sputnik, no longer be able to broadcast into the Eurozone, right? All of this is great. It's all long overdue, but all of this is great. But in terms of rallying a sort of a Western counter disinformation strategy, there's nothing like that, right? My friend and yours, Cliff May, always says that in order to convince people to buy aspirin, you first have to convince them that they have a headache, right? So we have figured out that we have a disinformation headache. We don't quite know what the aspirin is yet. And I actually think that one of the most important jobs for the next administration, the next Congress, is to actually start to get serious about disinformation. The Biden administration is manifestly not serious about disinformation. They've politicized the issue. They had this, they set the land speed record for the government agency that was set up and shut down the fastest, because they set up this disinformation governance board at the Department of Homeland Security. It was closed after 3 weeks, very foreseeably, by the way, because the optics on it were terrible. But what I worry about is that own goal that the Biden administration scored on itself may convince others, including Republicans who would otherwise take the issue seriously, to say, you know what, it's not an issue, right? Biden tried it. He tried to politicize it. We don't have to worry about it, because it is an issue. It's an issue that affects Democrats. It's an issue that affects Republicans, because what Putin is after, and it's not just Putin, it's also China and Iran and other actors, but mainly our focus here is Putin, right? What Putin is after is a sort of to diminish trust in democratic, transparent, pluralistic institutions, right? That affects all of us, right? So we should all have a vested interest in trying to fight it. I would really love to see this become a higher priority issue for the next Congress and for the next administration.
Great. Okay, so the audience questions I'm going to go to, and someone asked, why do you think there's been a number of suspicious deaths of Russian oligarchs lately?
So I was joking with my colleagues, right? Because I'm watching this also, and it's really, the numbers are really staggering, right? I think we've surpassed a dozen suspicious deaths, and my tongue-in-cheek response was that in the West we are concerned, right, with things like cholesterol and cancer and all sorts of diseases. In Russia, if you're of a certain political inclination, you're concerned with things like gravity and open windows, right? Because that's what's happening. You're seeing all these Russian oligarchs who are not towing the governmental line meet their untimely demise. Nobody that I know thinks that these are natural deaths, even though, the fig leaf that the Russian government says is that they're natural deaths. But it has a lot to do with the curation of opinion within the Kremlin's inner circles itself, right? So what you're seeing, right, over the large scale, right, especially as the war is going worse and worse, is that the circle of people around Putin is shrinking, right? Either because people are leaving or because people are dying, right? It's shrinking because no one has ever been rewarded for telling Vladimir Putin things that he doesn't want to hear, right? And you're beginning to see this in spades. And I think what you're seeing, these suspicious deaths, are a function of the fact that you're beginning to see cracks in the Kremlin consensus. There are people who have standing, they have some influence because of their economic wealth or because of their political position, and they're not saying the right things, right? And so it's easier for Putin to off them than to actually reassess what he's actually doing. So my sense is that's sort of what we're seeing.
Someone asked, since Russia supports Iran, how do the Saudis reconcile working with Russia, as Iran supports the Houthis and threatens Saudi in multiple ways?
Because my sense is that the Saudis, like everybody else in the region, doesn't see it as an either or proposition, right? The Saudis are a little bit more of an extreme case because they are the custodians of Mecca and Medina. They have, pride of place in Sunni Islam. But I was in the Emirates earlier this year, and I asked this precise question, right? This was at a time when the Emirates were engaged in pretty significant shuttle diplomacy with the Iranians, at the same time that they were getting missile attacks and drone attacks from Yemen's Houthi rebels, which are an Iranian proxy. And I remember asking government officials, how do you square this? How do you square this outreach that you're doing to the Iranians when the Iranians are trying to harm you materially? And the answer that I got was very diplomatic, with great difficulty, right? But I think there's something there, right? It's not an either or proposition, right? These are countries that are not separated from Iran by a large ocean, right? Iran is in their neighborhood, and they are going to have to deal with Iran no matter what happens, right? So remember that there was all this shuttle diplomacy that was taking place. The Emirates weren't the only ones that were doing it over the summer. Why? Because the timing had to do with US policy. That was the time where it looked like there was a JCPOA 2.0 that was in the offing, that the Iranians were about to be enriched. And so all these countries were trying to mitigate Iranian hostility, right? And so my sense is that there's a Saudi calculus there. I think the Saudis tried during the Trump administration to take a more forceful approach towards Iran and Iran's fellow travelers, right? You remember that the Saudis led the coalition to try to ostracize Qatar. And ultimately that didn't go anywhere. And I think there was a lesson there, right? Which is that there are limits to how much freedom the Saudis have to run politics in the Middle East. So my sense is they're hedging their bets. In terms of Saudi stability, they've sort of understood that their stability lies not in confrontation with Iran, but in the type of prosperity that closer ties with other Gulf states, closer ties with Israel can breed to them. So my sense is, a lot of people that I talk to talk about Saudi Arabia jumping on the Abraham Accords bandwagon, not as a question of if, but as a question of when. That's a reflection of sort of the internal calculus that they have. But that internal calculus, that economic prosperity calculus, I think is predicated on the idea that they don't have open warfare or even sort of behind the scenes warfare with the Iranians. So my sense is that's what they're thinking when they're balancing.
Interesting. So I'm going to combine a couple things, questions. Somebody asked, how do you characterize the Russia-Israel relationship and what do you foresee? And then somebody else wanted to know about Russian Jews and how they're faring through this.
Right. So I'm a Russian Jew, right? So it's something I can speak to. Look, so Israel is a country of 9 million people. There's something like 1.5 million to 2 million Russians or Israelis of Russian ethnic extraction that are now resident in Israel. And not all of them are Jews, by the way, right? There was a sort of a very strong wave of emigration in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union of people who were not Jewish, but they came because they had a Jewish spouse or they had Jewish relatives or whatever it is, right? They don't necessarily self-identify as Jews. This constituency is so significant that historically Russian politicians, including Vladimir Putin, have run ads for their own elections on Israeli state television, right? Because they see this as a core constituency. And this is why I would argue that for a long time, the sort of Vladimir Putin and sort of the folks around him in the Kremlin saw Russian Jews, Israeli Russians, as this sort of this political asset, right? That they could sort of, the sort of a community that was sort of sympathetic. By the way, the community that I come from, right? My parents are Soviet refuseniks. That was certainly not the case, right? They left the Soviet Union for a reason, right? And everybody of their generation had the same sort of very dim view of the Soviet Union and now Russia. But things have sort of changed. And that's why you saw, at least in the early going of the war, when there was a chance that the Israeli government could play an outsized role of mediating between the Ukrainians and the Russians, that there was a lot of equivocating. I don't think that's there anymore. I think it's very clear that sort of the Israeli public is squarely behind Ukraine. But that early fuzziness that you saw, my sense is it was the sort of the pull of the Russian ethnic Russian community that exists in Israel, and also the allure that Prime Minister Bennett had at the time of really being thrust onto the world stage to serve as a mediator. That didn't pan out, right? I think the Israelis have learned all sorts of lessons from that. And I also think, by the way, the Russians have learned lessons that, maybe the sort of the Russian Jewish community, the Russian Israeli community isn't quite the asset that they thought it was, in the past. But that's a fairly new realization, right? Historically, this has been something that Vladimir Putin has relied on, to the point where the anecdote that everybody always tells is that Vladimir Putin had a Jewish school teacher that he was very close to who emigrated to Israel, and she bequeathed him an apartment in Tel Aviv when she died. So Russia's president actually has property in Tel Aviv currently, I believe. So which tells you something about how comfortable he is there. I just hope he doesn't use that as his escape route, because that'll cause all sorts of headaches for the new government in Israel. So
assuming he's going to need an escape route. I think this is a very good question. What is the effect of Turkey moving closer and closer to Russia in terms of economy, trade, and military technical cooperation? How does this affect Israel and the U.S.?
So this is fascinating, right? So the best way I could characterize Turkish policy over the last 12 years or so is it's exceedingly opportunistic, and it's an attempt to sort of to have their cake and eat it too. Because if you notice, right? By the way, if you look in historical terms, the Russians and the Turks have historically fought more wars than any two countries, right? I think it's something like 12 over the last 1,200 years, right? There is no Turkish-Russian partnership, right? What there is there's this tactical alignment that President Erdogan has made with the Kremlin, for all sorts of reasons, right? Because Turkey needs energy, needs natural gas from Russia. Turkey needs commerce from Russia. I don't think the Turks see themselves as sort of, strategically aligned with the Russians over the long term. I think the Turks see that this, at least for a while, was a beneficial relationship. But what you're also seeing is that the Turks are trying to make other calculations. The Turks are constantly reassessing what the region looks like. The new closeness that you see over the last 6 months between Turkey and Israel, right? It's great. I love it. But let's be clear. It's not because all of a sudden Recep Tayyip Erdogan became a Zionist, right? He's not a Zionist, right? What he's looking at is the dynamism of Israel's relations with the countries of the Gulf, and he wants a piece of that action. He wants a piece of the sort of the trade and prosperity. He understands that looking to the east, are underdeveloped, underperforming countries that maybe he doesn't want to partner with. Maybe he wants to sort of, to take a bite out of this evolving dynamic. So I think the Turks are very pragmatic. I think he has very big aspirations. Part of those aspirations has to do with, countries that have historically fallen into Russia's geopolitical orbit, right? Countries in the Caucasus and Central Asia. So he has to play nice with the Kremlin up to a point. But I don't think there's a long-term strategic partnership there.
Do you think that there will ever be a price that Russia will pay for its war crimes?
It's a good question. What I always like to remind people of is that Russia is, to my understanding, the only country to date, nation state, to have engaged in WMD terrorism with impunity, right? So Russia has used chemical weapons and biological weapons to poison dissidents in places like London, with sort of no censure even, right? No lasting effects, no lasting sanctions to show for it. So if that's the track record, my sense is, unfortunately not. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but my sense is that the European community in particular, however this war turns out, is going to be very, very eager to turn the page, right? And if the Russians do things like pay restitution to the Ukrainians for destroyed property or whatever it is, which is something the Ukrainians are talking about, if the Russians agree to some measure of that, the Europeans are going to be more than happy to just sort of to wash their hands of the whole thing and then go back to business as usual, especially if Vladimir Putin is no longer in charge.
Right. So unfortunately, we have to end the program. It's 1 o'clock. And Ilan, as I promised at the beginning, you were terrific. You were insightful. And I really appreciate you sharing this past hour with us at Emmett. And I thank you all in the audience for joining. As I said, this will be recorded. It is being recorded, and you can look for it. It'll be distributed within the next day or so. Ilan, thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
So wonderful. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.